Professor Sugarman, I welcome you to Cardiff Law School, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation in our conference later on today. Now, this interview is part of a series of interviews with leading socio-legal authors organized by the Center for Law and Society. Now, the Center for Law and Society is based here in Cardiff. It has strong links with the Journal of Law and Society, and it is dedicated to promoting high-quality socio-legal scholarship. Now, you are yourself a leading socio-legal scholar and a distinguished historian of law. You are emeritus professor at Lancaster University, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a senior associate research fellow of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies at the University of London, and founding director of our sister institution, the Lancaster Center for Law and Society, which, if I'm not mistaken, must be the first of its kind in England and Wales. You have undertaken research for governments and non-governmental organizations, for the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Parliament's Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee. You have been consulted for several BBC TV and radio programs, and you have collaborated with English Heritage and with the British Library. You have been a visiting professor in Spain, Germany, Japan, Canada, and the United States, and you have authored or co-authored 20 books and almost 100 articles. Well, in short, Professor Sugarman, you're a very, very busy man, and therefore we're extremely grateful for accepting our invitation to participate in our conference, and also for setting a little time aside for this interview. Thank you very much for being here. Now, you have written on a tremendous range of topics, from equity to the architecture of legal buildings, from company law to law and literature, from criminal law regarding rape to transitional justice. And this without mentioning the main pillars of your work on the legal profession, legal education, jurisprudence, and human rights. There is an obvious polymathy here, almost of the Renaissance archetype. Now, what informs and what motivates your erudition into so many different areas? And are there any threads that connect your involvement in so many different fields?
Thank you, Christos, and thank you for your invitation to participate in this interview series. In terms of your question, I guess the starting point is intellectual curiosity. I'm interested in most things. I've got strong interests beyond the law, such as current affairs and the arts. I'm very passionately interested in the theatre, music, visual arts. So those sustain my broad interests. Also, I'm relatively, and have always been, relatively uninhibited about boundaries. Signs that say history, politics, transitional justice, keep out, have never put me off tracking down the road. When I was a graduate student at Cambridge, for example, in addition to studying law, I audited classes on English literature. I took courses on Joyce's Ulysses, the poetry of Gerald Manley Hopkins. I attended classes on fine art. My first attempt at writing an academic paper was to write a paper on T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. At Harvard, when I was a graduate student there, I took Daniel Bell's wonderful course on sociology. So I'm by definition a law and person. I see problems as problem-shaped, not disciplinary-shaped. Indeed, it's the making of connections between issues, disciplines, subjects that I find especially fascinating. Ian Forster got it absolutely right. Only connect, he famously said, and that is something that's very much fostered, spurred on my work. Also, I'm a bit of a holist. I have always sought to engage with and describe and analyse the larger picture, the phenomena I'm examining in their larger context, accepting that holism is, of course, in a sense, impossible. So I have tended to follow my nose. My career, Christos, is one of serendipity. It's been very largely unplanned. I've done what most people, almost everybody, would say is bad for your career. This is not the career path that one would recommend to one's students. It isn't associated with greater and greater specialisation. And of course, there are real dangers. There are dangers of spreading yourself too thinly, of being inadequately prepared, poor quality, poor quantity. It involves very hard work and it's very slow work. The virtues, however, are, I think, for me personally, have been enormous. I especially enjoy meeting and working with people in other disciplines. I find that enormously productive, stimulating and fun. So that, for example, I've been part, as you mentioned in your introduction, of a group of interdisciplinary group, international group of people working on women's rights, producing reports for the European Parliament on topics like quotas for women directors, and more recently, the support that we might provide for rape victims. In the field of law and history, I've undertaken a range of collaborations, whether it's working with historians and others to establish the first history workshop conference on law and society. I established both the legal history subgroups of the Socio-Legal Studies Society and the Society for Legal Scholars. At Lancaster, I've worked closely with historians, establishing a law and history annual lecture. I've worked with the American Society for Legal History. I've also, at Lancaster, established a group on the professions, bringing together people in the management school, people in sociology, people in law, people in linguistics, and so on. I've also worked with people at Lancaster to establish a group on the politics of memory, bringing together psychologists, linguistics, sociologists, historians, lawyers. And more recently, I've worked in the field of legal life writing, working with people in literature, lawyers, law, humanities and societies people. And this wide-ranging interest, finally, is reflected in my teaching. I've never been somebody who just teaches one field or indeed postgraduate students only in my area of specialism. One of the things I've really enjoyed has been teaching a wide variety of topics to a wide variety of people. I started teaching in Cambridge in 1971, teaching workers for the Worker Education Association, teaching them about the Industrial Relations Bill as then was in factories in Northampton and around Northampton. I've taught on MBA programs in business schools. I've taught on undergraduate basic social science courses. I've taught on postgraduate history courses, and I've taught international human rights courses in international relations schools. So I've had a lot of opportunities to be involved in a range of different subjects, and I think crucially, I've made a lot of opportunities to be involved with a lot of subjects and people in lots of different disciplines. That's instinctive. And I guess with the passion of the converted, I've been concerned in my work to convey the value of that making connections, of that building bridges with other disciplines. And that, I think, is part of the fact that inclusivity is very important to me.
I also think that you never miss an opportunity, apart from the other more grandiose occupations. You never miss an opportunity to teach secondary school children on specific legal topics once you have been invited to do so. Is there a preoccupation with you about connecting not only separate academic clusters amongst themselves, but also connect the academy, if you wish, with its outside, so with society writ large?
Yes, that's absolutely true. And that relates to the point I made earlier about inclusivity. Yes, I think it's really important to speak to a variety of audiences. Certainly my work has always been concerned, teaching and writing, and in terms of building bridges with across disciplines and so on, with reaching a diversity of audiences. I'm not just interested in talking to a small clique, and I think we as academics are under an obligation to use that grandiose term, public intellectuals, to reach out beyond our disciplines, to talk to people in other disciplines, and more generally to talk to the general public. And so I've really enjoyed the challenges of making radio programs on the history of criminal justice in 19th century England, or the Pinochet case more recently, and more generally encouraging, through the use of history, ordinary people to think about how we punish and prosecute people today.
Throughout your work, there is complete and refreshing, I think, lack of jargon. I mean that there is no complex terminology there. There is no overt adherence to grand theoretical constructs. Everything is in flowing English, even when the meaning it conveys is quite radical and challenges accepted truths. You cannot be, I don't think you can be categorized as a Marxist or a liberal or a feminist or a crit or a realist, Foucauldian, Weberian. Is this because you do not see much value in subscribing to specific theoretical currents, or is it a bit more conscious decision to keep some distance from labels?
Yes, thank you. Well, insofar as your question related to the importance of clarity in writing and thought, again, I think that's in part related to my concern about inclusivity and my wide-ranging interests. I'm concerned to communicate to the widest possible audiences. And I want them to read, understand, and indeed to be persuaded by my work. So lucidity, clarity, readability are for me a sine qua non. I'm not interested in preaching to the converted. I am repelled by what in the 60s and early 70s used to be called theoreticism. I enjoy and value good writing. Thus, for example, my work on Charles Dickens. Good historians tend to be wonderful writers, and that's no doubt one of the reasons why I've long been attracted to history. I'm a middle range thinker rather than an abstract one. I prefer to deal in specifics and their relationship to theory and vice versa. I was never the specialist teacher who just taught law graduates, as I explained earlier. I've taught a variety of audiences. And again, since I've done that and enjoyed doing that, clarity of exposition has been really important. I spent a number of years at Lancaster as the director of the first year Introduction to Law course. And when you're working with first years, as I was, year after year after year, communication, introduction to the foreign language that's the law and the issues it gives rise to are really important. And one final point, I suppose, and it's I guess, a matter of sort of my personal biography. I'm slightly dyslexic. And when I was a child at school and indeed at university, it was something that simply wasn't recognised. So reading and writing came to me very late. I was very behind, and writing has always been hard work for me. It's always been come slowly, which again partly explains my concern with clarity. My final point, I suppose, on writing is that more recently, certainly in my lecture presentations, I've increasingly used humour as a way of engaging my audiences. Again, of speaking to a wider range of people, but also engaging people's interests. I've found very belatedly in my career that humour is a really good way of bringing people in, bringing them on, and perhaps persuading them as well.
Much of your work examines the history of the legal professions, in plural. It can be captured under the headline, say, like lawyers and modernity from 1650 up to today. It shows lawyers as deeply involved into the relations and structures of economic and political power and ideology. But it also shows them, fascinatingly, I think, as crucial in shaping these structures and relations of economic, political power, ideology, even culture. What do you think the role of the lawyers, has been in making our world? Can we say that they are sort of an unsung hero of modernity, one that's a little controversial, perhaps?
Well, yes, my approach to lawyers has long been that they are very important. They're crucial facilitators and legitimators and need to be taken much, much more seriously than we perhaps do, particularly within legal education. One of the reasons they're so important, of course, is the way they straddle the public and private, the way they straddle law, politics, and business, the multiple roles and functions they operate, the many hats that they wear, the way that they construct regimes with one hand and deconstruct those regimes with the other hand. But of course, this is largely done, not in the courtroom, but privately, behind closed doors. And so it's been with the lower branch of the profession, the solicitors who have done that work behind closed doors, who are privy to vast amounts of inside information. They have historically known more about individuals and institutions than those individuals, families, and institutions did. So my goal has been to render them more visible and therefore more accountable. Thus, my work on the interplay between law, business and politics, my work on the development of the Law Society, both as a public and private institution, the work that I did with Yves Dieselet on lawyers and accountants, and more recently my work on cause lawyering, particularly in the context of the Pinochet case. So I'm concerned to describe and analyse the ways they sustain and diminish professional ideals. I'm concerned with the way that they construct pariahs, demonise individuals who challenge the status quo, who perhaps hold forth about the double standards that may be taking place in practice, the disjunction between ideals and practice. It does seem to me that lawyers are, in terms of legal education, the elephant in the room. We don't talk about them, and yet they're vitally important. And so it was, for the reasons that I've outlined, why I at Lancaster established a course on lawyers and society to raise consciousness about what lawyers do, how they go about them, and the larger political, economic and social consequences. In particular, foregrounding the ethical in those discussions.
Now, you are presently researching the history of sociolegal studies in Britain with a view of publishing, well, parts of it, at least in the shape of a monograph. Tell me about this content. What does it involve? What is we're trying to do? How?
Well, the project is essentially about the contextualist turn in British legal scholarship and education, largely focusing on scholarship. So it's about why it occurred, when it occurred, how it occurred, who was involved in it, and so what. My sources are interviews with legal scholars and others that I've conducted since the 1980s. It is, I think, the first oral legal history project in Britain. And I've conducted now about 50 interviews, allied to archival research and obviously the secondary literature as well. And of course, it's personal. This is my story. Exactly. And it's important to capture that story. It's important to capture my story before it's lost, before it's forgotten. In part, and this is something I'm going to be talking about in my lecture this afternoon, in part, my work here is to fill what seems to me an important gap. An important gap in that socio-legal studies perhaps is insufficiently interested in its own histories, in its histories of its own knowledges and cultures and concepts. The way that certain questions and concepts have their own histories and politics. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and think about that. I also think it's important, and this relates to in some ways to the inspiratory role of E.P. Thompson. It's important, as Thompson said in the preface to The Making of the English Working Class, to rescue the forgotten, the so-called failures from the condescension of history. And there is a sense in which I want to not only look at the winners, but I also want to look at the losers. I want to look at the marginalised. I want to examine what we might be able to learn from them, What were the opportunities missed? What then are the conditions that are more likely to sustain a richer, more critical, more thoroughgoing socio-legal studies? Susan Barty, who works on Australian legal education, recently wrote something to the effect that a discipline that has little tradition and no real understanding of its identity or where it came from is more vulnerable to outside pressure and is at risk of losing its sense of self. And so for those are the reasons why I've been undertaking this work on the contextual turn.
Yeah, this is one of the points that I wanted to press. I mean, in the sense, you're not just an observer, a historian observer of socio-legal studies in Britain. You're a first generation socio-legal scholar. You are, in a sense, involved here in writing the history of writing a history that you have helped create. Tell me a little bit about, well, the paths that led you into socio-legal studies and also your personal trajectory within it.
Yes. Well, as I think will be clear by now, I'm a law and person. So by the time I'd come down from university, I was looking for reference groups. I was looking for communities to sustain my law and passion. The Institute of Historical Research and the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies both became very important homes for me in London. I used to attend meetings of the Conference for Socialist Economists, Law and State Group meetings. I attended the early meetings of what were then called the Socio-Legal Group. The first conference I went to was in Sheffield. There were about 25 people. And by that stage, I think the group had an annual football match, which in my year was Scotland and the rest. And I remember Phil Thomas vividly playing with the rest, and me too. Subsequently, I was involved with Maureen Kane and Peter Fitzpatrick, establishing the European Conference on Critical Legal Studies. So lots of different but connected socio-legal activity. My personal trajectory within it, as you say, is that within the socio-legal community has been that I've been less involved in administration, as it were, but in creating subgroups. I mentioned, for example, the Law and History subgroup within Socio-Legal Studies Association, the Society for Legal Scholars. And in terms of my wider trajectory, I guess, going back to my undergraduate degree at Hull, one of the earliest things that engaged with my larger interests was thinking about law as policy. When I was studying torts, I was asked to read an article by Fleming on remoteness of damage and duty of care as policy mechanisms. It's published in the Canadian Bar Review. And the scales fell from my eyes. Okay, these legal mechanisms are about policy and politics. That was an important moment for me. Similarly, at Cambridge, I mentioned my work for the WEA. And in London, my work, particularly within the historical community, and my decision after 3 years of teaching in London, to go to the United States to escape the formalism, the confines, the conservatism of English legal education and scholarship. And so, like many, many other people before me and since, I was fortunate to go to the States. I went to Harvard in 1975, 76. I was there at the height of critical legal studies, and that was a revelation. And I was taught by the likes of Roberto Unger, Duncan Kennedy, Morton Horwitz. At Cambridge in England, I'd specialised in corporate law, in particular directors' duties. It seemed to me that directors' duties was a way in which somebody socially concerned like myself could challenge the weakness of directors' duties and posit arguments as to why they should be higher and why companies should be more accountable in society. And in doing that, my work became much more historical. And the dissertation I wrote for my diploma in comparative legal studies at Cambridge was very largely a history of the attenuation of directors' duties in England, and in some complex way, the relationship between it and the rise of laissez-faire as a political and legal discourse. It was remarkably, in some ways, Horwitzian before I'd encountered Morty. But there was nobody at Cambridge to really mentor me in that historical turn. But when I went to Harvard, initially again as a corporate law student, I encountered Horwitz. And I can well recall the moment when Hugh Collins and I were sat together. It was the Introduction to American Law course put on for foreign graduates at Harvard. And Morty gave a lecture on tort law. And I remember nudging Hugh to say, this is really astonishingly good. And so Hugh and I audited Mort's course on American legal history since 1890, of course, a subject matter way beyond the subjects that either Hugh or I had worked on previously. I shifted supervisors from a supervisor in corporation law to Morty. Morty supervised my dissertation. Duncan Kennedy examined it. And having been converted to the history of law and society, I came back to England to tool up in that specialism. And I was very fortunate. There were only, at that point in time, we're talking mid to late 1970s, only 2 modern legal history courses in England. One at Birmingham, taught by Tony Manchester, and one at LSE, taught by Stuart Anderson and Bill Cornish. And Bill was most kind, as was Stuart, most generous, and allowed me to audit that course. And so that course was vital for me in terms of boning up, skilling up, and developing skills in doing legal history. And then my decision to move to Lancaster was in the context of having been invited to take up a joint chair in law and history at Toronto, which I was ready to accept. But Lancaster came along, and because of the interdisciplinary opportunities there, and because of the promises that were made to me with a view in terms of supporting me as a head of department to create a avowedly contextualist law department with the ability to build interdisciplinary relations within and beyond the university, that I decided, albeit reluctantly, to not take up the Toronto post, but develop the post at Lancaster. And it's at Lancaster that, again, I've tried, whether it's establishing the Centre for Law and Society there, the work I've done with historians, work I've done on a range of topics, to sustain this larger interest I have and engage with socio-legal scholars and indeed bring them to Lancaster as well.
Okay. What do you think the major achievements of British socio-legal studies have been, and where do you see this current being today? Where does it stand?
Well, I think first of all, its achievement, which is significant. I mean, I think it's achieved a great deal in a very short amount of time, and all credit to the key actors in it. It's provided a community, a set of communities that was desperately needed. It's produced support, therefore, encouragement, intellectual stimulation. And of course, it has encouraged and reflected the pluralization of legal education in terms of subjects, audiences, and approaches, all of which have been very, very important. So there is much to applaud. Nonetheless, one would have to say that despite its best efforts, contextualism and socio-legal studies are still relatively at the margins of legal education and to some extent legal scholarship. They are still contested. There is still a struggle to maintain what we've achieved, to defend as well as extend. And being an organisation that was established very largely by law teachers, for understandable reasons, it, in my view, and this is something I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, has perhaps been insufficiently inclusive about others in other disciplines. The subject of my talk this afternoon is on the relationship between history and socio-legal studies. And I'm struck at the way in which wonderful work's being done in socio-legal studies on history and beyond history, which parallels wonderful work that's being done within history on law and society. And yet they barely talk to one another. Moreover, I'm concerned at the way in which socio-legal studies assumes historical developments, assumes teleologies, adopts an evolutionary functionalism, which means telling the narrative in a way that actually is extremely problematic and full of anachronism and myth, because it is based upon problematic or cosmic assertions that are not grounded in a thoroughgoing history. I'm not arguing that if we're more historical, if we talk to historians and others more, we will get to the real in uppercase. But what I do think is that we will secure better myth, and in the way that Peter Fitzpatrick and Wes Pugh, for example, have elaborated. So I think there is an issue about thinking about the law-history relationship is in part a way of thinking about what are socio-legal studies for? Where have we come from and where should we be going? Who are our audiences? Who is this for? Who is within? Who is without? Who do we include? Who do we exclude? And I think that's an important agenda of issues, in part because if you don't know where you're going, you're likely to end up somewhere else.
Like in Alice, eh? Okay. Let me now, the other major current strand of your research hopefully leading to another book, is the Pinochet case. Again, if you want, tell us about what does this research involve, and also, if I'm not mistaken, you might be the academic go-to person for the Pinochet case in Britain and beyond. What motivated you to be so involved into following the Pinochet?
Again, Christos, it really is serendipity to a very large extent. In the early 1990s, Stuart Shinegold and I decided that we wanted to work together on a comparative project on what now is known as cause lawyering. Lawyers who act very self-consciously on behalf of progressive causes. We put forward a program to the National Science Foundation in America to do a comparative project. And it got through the first barriers, it got sent back to us, and ultimately it was reluctantly turned down. Stu then went on to work with Austin Surratt in the cause lawyering group, which I was a founder member of, and has done wonderful work and put cause lawyering on the map. I, as a consequence of that work, became interested in transnational coalitions of lawyers, NGOs, and working on behalf of progressive causes. And one of my case studies was the effort to arrest Pinochet in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, in the early 1990s. So I established some contacts at Amnesty International. And that's where the matter really stood until October 1998, when I received a phone call from a friend at Amnesty who said, "David, it's a Saturday, I remember it vividly, I think you should sit down. You'll never believe it. They arrested Pinochet last night." I was amazed, and I rapidly decided that this was something that had to be written. And so I spent as much time during the next 18 months as I could in London, a bit like an anthropologist, observing the natives. I talked to the lawyers, the judges, the journalists, the victims, the NGOs, the politicians, and so on. Rapidly decided that this story had to be told transnationally. The upshot of which was I have ended up undertaking over 300 interviews in 12 countries. Now, the chutzpah of me doing this, I had absolutely no background in international human rights law, no background in the history of the politics of Latin America. I had no linguistic skills whatsoever in Spanish. This is not what you recommend your students to do. And it's been a vast project, which of course has taken a very long time to come to fruition, and much of it still hasn't come to fruition. But it is a topic in which I've written about, which I've broadcast about, written about for a variety of audiences, not just, again, the point earlier, I've written for The Guardian, The Times, Open Democracy, El Mostrador, a journal in a periodical in Chile, and so on. I've been very concerned to talk about the Pinochet case, and in particular, the law and politics of the Pinochet case, and what it tells us about law and politics, and more generally about the state of international human rights, and the role of law and lawyers therein at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century.
That's exactly my next question. You already mentioned that when it happened, I knew this must be written. It seems that you're almost engaging in a sort of history of the future, saying that with a trained historian's eye, you identify an event that will have repercussions, and you try to trace these future, the future possibilities and the future perspectives that it opens perspectives for, well, for human rights, for international law, also for the relation between the political and the judicial field. What were the implications of the Pinochet case in these areas?
Yes. Well, the immediate implications were that anybody who had contradicted, had acted, had impugned anyone who was likely who would be guilty of massive violations of human rights had to, if they were travelling abroad, put a lawyer in their suitcase. They could be arrested, like Pinochet, detained and tried on the basis of this doctrine of universal jurisdiction, that all civilized countries have an obligation with respect to certain crimes that are so heinous, torture, disappearance, genocide, crimes against humanity, that either they arrest and try this individual or extradite them to a country that did. Now, obviously, that has major consequences. It opened up a really significant lever. Its impact has been very wide-ranging. It's, for example, in Chile, it's the arrest of Pinochet and the fact he was out of the country for almost 18 months meant that judicial investigations took place. Judges in Chile who I interviewed were ashamed at the fact that it was British courts, not they, that were bringing Pinochet to book. Not all of them by any means, but a minority certainly were energized by the Pinochet case. And what we've seen with respect to Chile is that there has been unprecedented activity with respect to investigating and prosecuting cases since the arrest and detention of Pinochet. Not nearly enough, and it's all been very slow, and the sentences, insofar as there are sentences, are problematic. But nonetheless, it's an incredible change, and moreover, it's acted as a role model for many other countries in the world. Many other leaders and former leaders have been brought to book. Just within the last week, we've seen in the Habre case in Africa, the so-called African Pinochet, we've seen the former leader of Chad tried in Senegal and found guilty of crimes against humanity and will be sentenced there. But, of course, this very important shot across the bows of our world leaders, who are normally immune from prosecution, protected by a blanket of immunity, comes also on a basis at a time when the double standards that undoubtedly exist in this area are increasing and increasing. And by those double standards, I mean that, well, it's not that difficult to go after a relatively small middle-range country like Chile or after various African nations. But what about the United States? What about China? What about Britain? What about Russia? And so on. And until universal jurisdiction applies equally across the board, then there will be perfectly legitimate criticism that that it's simply a tool of the West. It's simply another form of neo-colonialism. Moreover, and finally, there are real concerns about international human rights as simply a new field of business for lawyers. It's lawyerization, that lawyers take over a field and therefore shove to the margins what are essentially political and economic issues. that the problem becomes almost exclusively legal rather than one where law is an element, but where the political and economic dimensions and questions and issues that need to be addressed are paramount. And with that goes a certain positivism in the approach to international human rights that concerns me. Kieran McElvoy, in a lovely essay in the Journal of Law and Society, it's one of his prize-winning essays, has written about this, and I very much agree with his critical analysis there.
You've already started answering this question. Yeah. Do you have a clear view, a settled opinion in regarding the human rights agenda or the human rights doctrine? Because it is, at least within the academy, it has become a little problematicized on the sense that, well, most people, I think, would welcome as a very healthy and desirable legal and political principle that, well, top state officials will not be impune for mass violence, destructive violence against people. On the other hand, the issues that you have mentioned already, that it's, well, a little bit too universal, that it is perhaps very selective in its application, and also when it comes to engage corporations, it has the potential to actually enhance the power of big, especially Western states and corporations over the people that human rights was meant to protect. Have you made up your mind in this? Have you have a settled view?
And of course, all this is in the context of the attenuation of international human rights post 9/11. I mean, we've seen, basically, Pinochet occurred at the high watermark, in my view, of international human rights. That period from 98 to 2000 was when you could do stuff that you were never able to do before, and to some extent, never been able to do since. And the process, though it's a zigzag one of attack, counterattack, riposte, nonetheless has been that many of the advantages and gains that were won in 98-2000 have been attenuated, have been cut back with the so-called war on terrorism, which has made, therefore, human rights even more important than ever. But on the other hand, yes, it's problematical for some of the reasons that I've outlined. And it's any study or treatment, analysis of international human rights law has to therefore acknowledge and address the paradoxical character of international human rights. It comes at certain costs. There are certain things that we need to be aware of. Certainly, it has to be much less lawyer-driven and top-down, and much more bottom-up and non-lawyer, victim and so on, driven than it perhaps has been, at least until recently.
So back to the Pinochet case, we're not exactly certain yet, I reckon, if it is a high mark, a watershed, or an outlier, or even an anomaly.
It's all of those.
It's all of those. Okay. Now, my final question to round up the discussion, regards, well, I wanted to ask you, what are the main intellectual figures that have influenced and even guided your own work throughout the years? What are they, and how did they influence your work?
Yes. Well, I'll give you three to start with, I think. There are obviously many who I'm enormously grateful to. The first would be Edward Thompson, the social historian. Reading The Making of the English Working Class as an undergraduate switched on a light bulb for me. It's a big book, and I'd not been used to reading big books with thick description of the kind in making. But It was just wonderful, wonderful, narrative, passionate. It was about agency. It was about the marginalised and rescuing the marginalised. And then in Whigs and Hunters and Albion's Fatal Tree, Edward writes about law as both an instrument of oppression, but also as, at least on some occasions, a tool that the lower orders, the disadvantaged in society, can nonetheless use against the powerful. And Edward also stressed the important role of negotiation, that there was often, at least in early modern England, a complex set of negotiations that went on in society between the haves and have-nots, particularly his notion of the moral economy of the crowd. So at an intellectual level and a political level, he was important.
Also very resistant to notions of theory over determining social reality and social life.
He's of course in the celebrated debate about Althusser, and one of the highlights of my life, I guess, was going to Oxford to the History Workshop Conference, where he debated with Stuart Hall in this church. I mean, it had a kind of biblical religious quality to this debate. Stuart defending postmodernism and structuralism, and Edward challenging it deeply. Whilst I share Edward Thompson's reservations, I nonetheless think he went too far and was overly simplistic about Althusser and more generally the role of theory in history and history writing. But he's nonetheless been a very important role model. I spoke to him on a couple of occasions through the good offices of Douglas Hay. And although one has, of course, now reservations about his work, not just that he went too far in that wonderful essay, The Poverty of Theory, but about the issues that he didn't tackle, the people that aren't there, notably, of course, women. There are almost no women in making, let alone Albion's Fatal Tree and Whigs and Hunters. So Edward Thompson, very important to me in many, many ways. The second would be Morton Horwitz, professor at Harvard Law School. For the reasons I explained, Morty's lectures changed my life, made me want to become a historian, made me want to do, or ratified, confirmed my view that I should be doing historical work. Again, it was the passion of his classes, the passion he brought to the subject, the passion that he brought to the subject matter. There was his contextualization, his study of law as an intrinsically political institution. And that's always the way I've seen law, but I never knew quite how to write about it. Now, of course, Morty's contextualization, admirable in its goals to highlight the interplay between law, economic interests, and power and ideology. Really important, really valuable. But I was critical of the way he went about it. And I came back to England. One of the first things I did after studying with him was write a critical review of his first book, Transformation of American Law, 1780 to 1860. And it was published by the Journal of Law and Society. Phil Thomas gave me an important break for which I'm most grateful there. And it critiques his instrumentalism, his simplistic causal connections, and highlights the way in which that kind of instrumentalism is an inadequate way of writing law in history, law in context, law in society. But nonetheless, Morty has been a very powerful influence for the reasons I've explained. The final key individual, and I'm struck as I say it by the fact that all three are actually historians, is Bob Gordon, Robert W. Gordon, now professor at Stanford, as well as long-standing professor of law at Yale. For me, Bob has been an exemplar in terms of the writing of the intellectual history of law and of historiography of law, as well as writing on the history of the legal profession. He's been a very important model for me on how to write legal history and to write it lucidly. Bob's a very good writer. Bob cut his teeth in the world of journalism, and it shows, as well as he's wonderfully smart. I've been the privilege to know Bob. He's a friend. We've taught together. Crucially, we work together in a number of summer workshops at the University of Western Ontario. Every year, Bob and I and David Flaherty, a Canadian legal historian, would teach the English-American-Canadian law and society history to Canadian law teachers and historians who wanted to engage with law and history. And working with Bob at that point in time was one of the most exciting and stimulating moments of my life. And his work since then has just been an exemplar for me.
Professor Sugarman, thank you very, very much for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much.
Now let's run to the conference.
Thank you.